Okay, let's start with modern perspectives. So, we're going to talk about a lot of different concepts very quickly, and we're going to very briefly touch on these different ideas. We're not going to spend a lot of time on them. I personally don't think it's necessary that we memorize and remember each person connected to each concept. In my view, we're going to look at a more global understanding of the different ideas that brought us to where we are today. So these things are all, I think, historically important, but we don't have a quiz that's like, who did this and who did that. It's not, I don't think that's the most effective way to kind of get this information across. So we're just going to talk about them kind of in general and go over them now. So some different perspectives. Okay. Structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic theory, Gestalt psychology, behaviorism, and humanism. And we're going to get into them on the next slides. Okay. William Wundt is credited as one of the founders of psychology. He was the structuralism person. He created the first lab specifically for psychological research. Wundt emphasized structuralism. He focused on understanding structure and characteristics of the mind through introspection, so looking in. So this is a process by which someone examines their own conscious experience in an attempt to break it into parts and kind of figure out why they're thinking what they're thinking. And I will note one of the reasons that I have additional slides after these for the other stuff in psych history is because look at this picture. This picture is great, right? It's showing him in the first lab, fellow researchers, but they all look kind of the same. They all look like white European men. Nothing wrong with being a white European man, but they're not the only people that donated or kind of gave information to this field, right? So I think it is important to talk about them, but also know there is more to the story. Okay, William James, functionalism. Shown here in a self portrait, and why you would do a self portrait, giving yourself the side eye, I don't know. That's up for debate. But he drew from the function of cognitive processes. So this was emphasizing how mental activities contribute to basic environmental survival. So as a functional way to like stay alive, to do the thing, right? Problem solving as a way to continue existing in the environment. Okay, Freud, and we'll get into Freud later more, but we do talk about him historically in the context of him being the person who founded psychoanalytic theory. And this is a theory that we still look at the other ones today, but this is clinical psychology, basically, talk therapy. This all came originally from him kind of doing this work originally. He studied hysteria and neurosis, among other things. He theorized that many of his patients' problems came from the unconscious mind and believed that one way the unconscious mind could be accessed was through dream analysis. We'll talk about more on this later, but this theory basically focuses on the role of a person's unconscious and early childhood experiences. Now, however sideways some of his research kind of looks today, we can today say with conviction that your unconscious thoughts do matter and your childhood experiences do matter. However, his research was not super scientific, but it still was helpful. So we still appreciate the contribution to the field. We just kind of make sure we recognize kind of the bigger picture versus the details of some of his work. A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis was his major publication. He was very influential in the history. And this one of his books, this was published in 1922, and that was kind of his general introduction to analysis. Okay, Gestalt psychology, which we have a whole section on, future us, we'll get into in a future section. Kohler, Kafka, and Wertheimer were German psychologists who immigrated to the US to escape Nazi Germany. They worked in Gestalt psychology, the idea of the whole. So, whole meaning like one piece. So, this is based on the idea that although a sensory experience can be broken down into individual parts, how those parts relate to each other as a whole is often what we respond to in our perception. So, ideas of Gestalt continue to influence research on sensation and perception today, and we'll look at a bunch of that in a future lecture. Okay, Pavlov. If you've heard of Pavlov's dogs, this is the guy, Ivan Pavlov. He discovered the concept of classical conditioning. He studied conditioned reflexes where an animal produced a reflex, an unconscious response to a stimulus, drooling or salivating in the presence of food, and over time was conditioned to produce the response to a different stimulus, salivating or drooling to the sound of a bell that the experimenter associated with the original stimulus. So the food and the bell became connected. So, what is this in normal language? Well, he had dogs. When he gave them food, they drooled. Well, he thought, what if I can connect something else to this natural thing that happens that has nothing to do with it? So he used a bell and he said, okay, the bell is completely neutral. Nothing happens when I ring this bell. But if I give the food at the same time I ring the bell over and over and over again, eventually I can ring the bell and the dog will drool as if they were going to get food. So he figured out you could connect this neutral thing to something that was a natural reflex. However, if you never gave food with the bell, like if you trained it and then never gave food with the bell again, it would go away. The behavior would become extinct. But it is interesting that he was able to connect this natural reaction with a completely neutral thing. So that is the idea of classical conditioning, and we have a whole section on this later. Okay, John Watson is known as the father of behaviorism within psychology. He thought that the objective analysis of the mind was impossible. So he looked at observable behaviors instead and ways to bring that behavior under control. So today behaviorism is used in behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a whole field all of its own. But basically he said, well, we can't really scientifically like, how do you study feelings, right? It's weird. So he said, we're going to work on behaviors because we can see them, and work on changing the part we can see. And maybe that will impact the rest, but really, he was concerned with the part that was measurable and visible. Okay, Skinner was operant conditioning. He was concentrating on how behavior was affected by consequences. So he studied the principles of modifying behavior through reinforcement and punishment, which he saw as the factors that drove behavior. So basically, um, this is Skinner's box, and it was used in a bunch of different research settings. It's still used today in some ways. But basically, if the lever is pushed and a light comes on, then the rat gets a treat. So it was like they would never push a lever in real life, right? But in this box, they learned if I do this thing, the consequence is this other thing. So they figured out if I push the button or the lever, I get food. So they learned to do this new thing to get a reward. And other times, they would learn if they did other things, there was no reward, right? So it was basically showing them reward and punishment can modify behavior. Okay, Maslow and humanism. So he's one of the humanism people, and he proposed this hierarchy of human needs and motivating behavior. We will talk much more about this in a future section because this is not the only answer. This doesn't apply to everyone on the planet, but it kind of makes sense in the concepts that kind of he puts it out there in. So he asserted that as long as the basic needs for survival were met, we could work on higher level needs to motivate behavior. So his opinion was if you don't have food or shelter, you can't worry about relationships, right? He was kind of like everything needs to go in steps. However, we know now, and he added more steps to his pyramid later. But we know now you can like bounce around on this pyramid throughout life. And also you don't necessarily have to have a perfect conditions to be able to move to the next level. We also know this doesn't really apply in all societies. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense because there are some societies in the world where there is no safety for whatever reason, where there is no security for food or shelter in the same way that we think of it in our part of the world. So the pyramid doesn't work for everybody, but it is helpful to kind of conceptualize how people are motivated in general. Okay, Carl Rogers is another humanism person. He developed client centered therapy that has been very influential in clinical settings. So, think back a few minutes ago to Freud. Freud was analyzing what everybody said. He was analyzing it. Well, Rogers looked at it and said, "You know what? What if we give unconditional positive regard? We don't judge anything. We are genuine in our care. We give empathy." It's kind of a different approach to therapy or analysis compared to Freud. So this is client-centered therapy. Then the cognitive revolution, so by the 1950s, new stuff was happening in linguistics, in neuroscience, in computer science, and the mind became a new focus of study. Chomsky was very influential in the beginning of this revolution, and he felt that psychology needed to incorporate different types of mental functioning in order to fully understand human behavior. Okay, contemporary branches of psychology. This list is broken down on the next few slides, so we're just going to get into it. Okay, so biopsychology is studying how structure and function of the nervous system is connected to behavior. This could include things like sensory and motor systems, sleep, reproductive behavior, neurodevelopment, plasticity of the nervous system, all sorts of interesting stuff. Then, sensation and perception is an area that's focusing both uh, physiological parts of the sensory systems and the psychological experience of sensory information. So, sensation is the sensory information like sight, sounds, touch, smell, and perception is the experience of the world that's influenced by where we focus our attention, our previous experiences, and our cultural backgrounds. So, sensory is the information coming in, perception is what we do with the information. And we have a whole section on this later. And I have an example here that's a traditional, it's been around forever. When you look at the image, you may see a duck or you may see a rabbit. Or maybe you see both. Which one do you see first? Do you never see the other one? Do you only see one, right? Kind of interesting. So, sensory information is the same regardless, right? It is the same picture, it's not changing. But our perception can vary with time, with perspective, and depending on our background. So, kind of interesting. Cognitive psychology is a branch of psych that focuses on cognition and thoughts and their relationship to our experiences and our actions. So it has to do with attention, problem solving, language, and memory. Developmental psychology has a bunch of key people in it. We'll talk about a few of them. Only one, just one, is Piaget, and we talk about Piaget as one of our people. He's not the only one, but he's my example. So, developmental psychology looks at the physical and mental parts of aging and maturation. So, like conception to death, basically. So, this includes a lot of different skills that we learn throughout the lifespan, like moral reasoning, thinking skills, social skills, all of these things. And Piaget is famous for his ideas regarding changes in cognitive ability that happen as we move through the lifespan. So, move through infancy into adulthood. Okay, personality psychology is looking at thoughts and behaviors that are unique to each person that might have to do with how our personality kind of works. And this five-factor model is just one example of many different ways that we can look at personality psychology. But each of these dimensions of this five-factor model is outlined in this graphic. And basically, it shows that someone who might score high on one trait or lower at another trait, like things that might kind of fit with their personality. So there's tests that we can do, and I'll put them out there for you. When we get to this module, if it's, you guys can take them yourself and see. I mean, they're on the internet for you, but I have some good ones that are I know are free that I give to you guys when we get to this section. So say someone is high in conscientiousness, right? Which is like competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, being goal-driven. Well, if they're high in that, maybe they're hardworking, dependable, organized. Maybe if that trait is a little lower for them, they might be a little disorganized, maybe careless, maybe impulsive. Now, all of these things are not exclusively true, right? It's not like someone who's hardworking is never impulsive. That's not what it's saying. It's just giving a general idea. Okay, social psychology is a huge section of the class that we will go through. And this is just one example. Stanley Milgram was a researcher that looked at people obeying orders from an authority figure, and we'll get into his study in a couple of sections. And so social psychology might look at different concepts, how people interact and relate with other people, and how interactions can affect behavior. So this could have to do with prejudice, attraction, interpersonal conflicts, obedience, like all of these things. And then health psychology. So this is where this is a branch that focuses on how individual health is directly related or affected by biological, psychological, and sociocultural influences. So the biopsychosocial model suggests that health and illness is determined by an interaction of these three things. So the biology part, like the structural or chemical part, and the psychological, like all the stuff that how we think, how we feel, our environment, how we are raised, and all of that. And then the social is like the rest of the world around us. So this biopsychosocial model is a big word that just means we know we have to take all three pieces into consideration when we're considering someone's psychological health and the study of health psychology. Then clinical psychology, this focuses on diagnosis and treatment of psych disorders and problematic patterns of behavior. This includes clinical therapy, counseling, talk therapy. This is all like one piece. And this triangle is something we will see later in another section. But basically, it's just kind of showing how emotions impact thoughts, but thoughts also impact emotion, right? And emotions may change how our behaviors play out and vice versa, right? Our behaviors or someone else's behaviors could change our emotion. So all of these things impact each other. It's not a one-way street. It's everything is going in both directions at once. Then, super briefly, industrial organizational psych is looking at workplace stuff, organizational structure, workplace environment, personnel management. Sports and exercise psychology is the psych aspects regarding sports and performance. It could include motivation, performance anxiety, and general mental well being within a sports context. And then forensic psychology is dealing with the justice system, and it might not be just in the courtroom. It might be outside of the courtroom, doing research into like what's gone on in a situation in a family, in family court. It might have to do with criminal investigation, deciding if someone is able to is fit to stand trial. Like it is the forensic psychology is a huge field. So it could include assessment, it could include treatment suggestions, it could include working through eyewitness testimony, like all sorts of stuff. Super interesting. Okay, careers in psych. Most careers in psych require some type of degree past a bachelor's, but there are things you can do with a bachelor's in psych. Um, Lots of psych technicians jobs start with a bachelor, so they're like there are things you can do, but many of them include a little bit more education than just that 4-year degree. Some of them include teaching, research, counseling, social work, and corporate and marketing stuff. And then here's a chart from 2023. The whole point of this chart, it's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's just kind of showing that many people in psych work in different fields, basically. It's just saying, like, people with a psych degree are all over the place for occupational groups. Okay, so that's it for this section. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for your attention.